What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with Dr. Layla Brown and Dr. Gerald Horne.
You're tuned in to our very special episode, LDI presents the Gerald Horne Report.
Y'all, we are about to jump into this wide-ranging and amazing conversation with one of our heroes, one of our comrades, Dr. Gerald Horne.
Who really needs no introduction because he is a friend of the show, but for the sake of continuity, we'll offer yet another bio. So Dr. Horne holds the Morris Professorship of History and African American Studies. His research has addressed issues of racism in a variety of relations involving labor, politics, civil rights, international relations, and war. He has also written extensively about the film industry. Dr. Horne received his Ph.D. in history from Columbia University and J.D. from the University of California, Berkeley, and his B.A. from Princeton. Dr. Horne is the author of more than 30 books and 100 scholarly articles and reviews. He is currently completing histories of Texas and Washington D.C. We are so happy to have you back, and we know that our audience will be equally excited.
Thank you for inviting me. In a footnote, I'm at the University of Houston.
All right, so let's hop right in because we have a lot of ground to cover. So let's start on the African continent. So right now there are large general strikes happening in Eswatini and Sudan. There have been at least 3 coups attempted this year, including in Guinea, Mali, and Chad. And AFRICOM continues to expand its presence among many other developments. So can you speak to some of these issues and why it is that the US has been largely silent about many of these developments, especially the unrest in Eswatini?
Well, that last question is particularly appropriate. You may know that just a few days ago, there was an international day in solidarity with Zimbabwe, which is still languishing under sanctions imposed by Washington, London, and Canberra, speaking of Australia in particular. This was in reaction to a land reform that expropriated land from the European minority, many of whom had only shown up in that part of Africa as recently as 1945, post-World War II, and redistributing that land to the African majority. Now, what's interesting is not only the slapping of sanctions on Zimbabwe and the curdling attacks on the leadership, including skits on Saturday Night Live, believe it or not, but also the fact that many in the Black community, particularly Black liberals and Black leftists, were in solidarity with US imperialism with regard to these sanctions, which the neighbors, including South Africa, was opposed to, even though the vaunted sainted Archbishop Desmond Tutu, during that fraught period, had actually counseled an invasion of Zimbabwe, believe it or not. I thought he was a man of peace. But this was a very curious turn of events. And if you go back and look at the Black Scholar, when they did a special issue during this tense period on Zimbabwe, I wrote an article entitled Why Zimbabwe? And I began the article talking about a small Southern African nation that was deeply corrupt, that was enmeshed in violent political repression. And of course, I was talking about the nation then known as Swaziland or Eswatini. And I wondered and pondered why there was not much more of an outcry, particularly amongst these Black liberals and leftists who were in high dudgeon about Zimbabwe. Why weren't they more outraged about Eswatini? And I still ask that question today, as you see protesters in Eswatini being shot down on the street, particularly young people. This is the last absolute monarchy on the African continent. One would think that that would stir the conscience of many of these folks who were so outraged by what they thought they were seeing in Zimbabwe. Interestingly enough, a commentator on National Public Radio in the United States, after the regime in Zimbabwe was forced to walk back some of the land reform, she asked rather innocently, although devilishly, that meant that these Europeans in Zimbabwe were receiving reparations which in a sense was true. So in other words, you had many of these Black Americans who had successfully lobbied for reparations to the European minority in Zimbabwe were being quiet as a church mouse with regard to what's going on in Eswatini. And that's part of the problem, because you also mentioned the events in Sudan and Mali and Guinea-Conakry, the illicit regime change that took place in Chad. And what's interesting is not only the rather promiscuous role of US imperialism, you mentioned AFRICOM, for example, the African Command, but also the unfolding contestation between Washington and Paris. Now, Paris was upset with Washington because, as you know, Washington intervened to scoop up a multi-billion-dollar submarine deal with Australia that France thought was all theirs. You saw that Mr. Biden and President Macron kissed and made up at the G20 summit just recently in Italy. And so what's interesting about that, of course, is that once again, to continue this critique, you have many in the Black American community who, once again, are in high dudgeon about the role of China, purportedly or allegedly, in Africa, but don't have a mumbling word to say about the role of France, even though France is the major vampire in Africa. Its role in Africa gives it pretense to playing the role of a major power, and yet there's nothing to say about this, even though it's now wreaking havoc. You might recall what happened in Cote d'Ivoire about a decade ago, when there was an electoral conflict between the eventual winner, Alassane Ouattara, and the man who was ultimately defeated, Laurent Gbagbo. You had French paratroopers landed in Cote d'Ivoire, bundled up Gbagbo and his spouse, trundled them off to the International Criminal Court to stand trial, where of course they were just released earlier this year. And once again, I'm still waiting for an outcry from some of these people who were so concerned about Zimbabwe. Now, I have a special interest in Sudan. You may know that when I was doing law, I was asked by the Union of Arab Jurists to try to get involved in mediating the civil war then unfolding in Sudan, which at that juncture had the reputation of being Africa's largest country by territory. But under the administration of one George W. Bush, you saw the secession of South Sudan from the larger Sudan, which at once removed oil resources from the coffers in Khartoum, the larger Sudan. And needless to say, my effort failed, but it has led me to continue an abiding interest in what goes on in that country. And just a few days ago, as you know, there was a coup. And coincidentally enough, now people in LDI don't tend to be coincidence theorists, I'm sure, but coincidentally enough, you had the US envoy, Jeffrey Feltman, who had met with the coup leaders just before they decided to plot a coup, just as in Guinea-Conakry in September 2021, you had the coup leaders who were taking courses from US military instructors, and during a lunch break, they got the bright idea of overthrowing the government. And coincidentally enough, they had just been involved in sessions with US military leaders. I mean, these are, as I said, this country, they moved from being so-called conspiracy theorists to coincidence theorists. So what's happening is that not only was the government weakened, you may recall that just a year or two ago, the long-term leader, Mr. al-Bashir, was toppled as a result of mass protests. In the incoming administration, Washington twisted the incoming administration's arm and induced them to sign on to the so-called Abraham Accords, which involves recognition of Israel, which helped to engender unrest in the streets like it did in Morocco, due west. And as well, Washington decided that Sudan had been a state sponsor of terrorism And so it scooped about $500 million out of the Sudanese treasury to redistribute it to so-called victims of terrorism, which obviously weakened the incoming administration, leading to unrest in the streets. And it's unclear where Sudan goes from here. Although if I were a betting man, I would not necessarily bet on the longevity of the military junta now in power, despite the fact that they're receiving support from US ally Egypt, support from US ally Saudi Arabia, particularly because they've sent troops to Saudi's failing war in Yemen, just across the Red Sea, up to and including children with rifles to fight in Yemen. And not to mention that Sudan is seen as critical with regard to what's going on in neighboring Ethiopia, particularly the attack by Tigrayan rebels on the Addis Ababa regime. And Sudan has a territorial dispute with Ethiopia, or you could say with Tigray. Likewise, Egypt, which is maybe considered the power behind the military throne in Khartoum, also has a beef with Ethiopia since it's building the Grand Renaissance Dam, which Cairo claims is challenging its lifeblood, speaking of the Nile River. So once again, I'm waiting with bated breath for our friends in the Black community who spoke out with such vigor against land reform in Zimbabwe to speak with equal vigor about some of these other disputes I've just outlined.
Well, we'll see how we hold our breath for that one. But speaking of bloodthirsty beasts on the continent, can you say something about past and present CIA incursions in Africa, not least of which what's happening in Congo and Ghana, and what sources are being examined to get this information?
Well, I'm glad you raised that question because I'm reviewing a book for Covert Action Quarterly. You might recall that its predecessor, a Covert Action Information Bulletin, was started some years ago by disgruntled US intelligence agencies, including the late Philip Agee, whose book on the CIA is still worth reading, and of course, the late William Schacht as well. And the book is by Susan Williams of London. It's called White Malice, and it focuses on Ghana and Congo. Once again, Black Americans are implicated because recall that before the coup that overthrew Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Nkrumah coming to power in 1957, toppled by 1966, that Washington had deposited a new ambassador, NAACP leader Franklin Williams, in Accra, and there have been serious allegations about his having this coup on his resume. This book, White Malice, also talks about a number of Black CIA agents, because Washington concluded early on, that it could be useful to have Black CIA agents in Africa that they could easily pass, to use the verb of the present. And indeed, if you look at my book, White Supremacy Confronted, on Southern Africa, you'll find that as early as the 1950s, the NAACP leadership was trying to flip leaders of the African National Congress of South Africa into the column of the CIA and US imperialism. Of course, that was part of this grand bargain between the Black leadership, where in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions, we would not only participate in such ill-advised ventures as collaborating with the CIA, but also participate in throwing leaders like Paul Robeson overboard, which has handicapped and crippled our community to this very day. And with regard to sources, what I found interesting about this book, which is why I'm glad you asked this question, is that apparently with regard to this legislation that called for the release of government documents on the assassination of John F. Kennedy, it's led to a trove of documents being released about the nefarious US role in Africa, particularly the CIA role. And that's what Susan Williams draws upon heavily. So that's a tip to researchers. And also you might have seen just the other day that the current US president called a halt to releasing of these documents, which of course is pursuant to legislation. He said it was due to COVID and the fact that the National Archives is having difficulty plowing through the thousands of pages. Others are not so sure. The release of documents is supposed to be resumed within a year or two. And I think that we should keep a close eye on that because there is still a lot to be said about the role, not only of US imperialism, but the CIA in particular. I talk about this a bit with regard to Angola, this Southwest African nation, which comes to independence in 1975. And we all know, per the memoir by former CIA agent John Stockwell, that the CIA was involved up to its neck in activities in Angola. In my book, I talk about Whiteness, a former so-called Black leader in the United States, the leader of the Congress of Racial Equality after it took this turn supposedly towards Black nationalism and Black militancy. He was recruiting directly for the CIA, recruiting mercenaries, in fact. It's all in the newspapers. It was a matter of public record. And what's interesting there, and I'm sure this may come up later, is that just recently, I was involved in a discussion with members of a Black fraternity, the name of which will go unnamed. And I thought it was going to be a typical discussion about amongst Black Americans, you know, the Black conditions, what is to be done, et cetera. But instead, it turned into a kind of attack on Cuba, of all things. And Angola comes up in that context because we all know that Cuban troops were dispatched to Southern Africa in the 1970s to turn back an invasion by apartheid South Africa, assisted by the US CIA. That turned the tide for liberation of Southern Africa, which helps to explain why in 1994, when Nelson Mandela was inaugurated, that the stormiest applause was for Cuban leader Fidel Castro. But of course, these Black fraternity members waved that all away. And they had the nerve and temerity to lay a bouquet of rhetorical flowers at the doorstep of Jonas Savimbi, who was the CIA man in Angola. And what's interesting there is that they did this because most of their information on Cuba had come from one Carlos Moore. Now, if you look at Carlos Moore's Wikipedia, which is very favorable to this anti-communist Cuban, you'll find that he was very close to Zimbabwe. I also pointed out in our discussion, because they were trying to refight the Cold War. In other words, during the Cold War, and this arises in the Sixth Pan-African Congress in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania in 1974, which I also talk about in the White Supremacy Confronted book, and I pointed these folks to my sources, that there was this alleged conflict between the so-called Black nationalists from the United States and then the socialists from everywhere else in the Pan-African world. And of course, the so-called Black nationalists were not only supportive of the CIA man, Savimbi, surprisingly enough, or perhaps not surprisingly enough, unsurprisingly enough, but right before the convening of the Pan-African Congress, President Nyerere, the founding father in Tanzania, had to arrest a number of Black Americans who were accused of smuggling weapons into Tanzania. They said to transport to Savimbi across the continent in Angola, the Tanzanians were not so sure. And so I was wondering, why are these people trying to resuscitate and revive all of this history that really doesn't reflect well on their ideological position? And in retrospect, I think that is for a number of reasons. One is that, as Professor Burton Stelly knows more than most, post-1945, you had this ideological tsunami in Black America. The Black liberals, led by the NAACP, as noted, participated in the ditching and stabbing in the back of Blacks to their left, like Paul Robeson, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois. And then with regard to the Black nationalists, it's a very curious phenomenon, because if you look at the historiography of Black nationalists, many are quick to point out, which I think is accurate, to draw a connection, say, between Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X. Marcus Garvey passes away in 1940. Malcolm X becomes prominent, let's say, by the mid-1950s. So what happens between 1940 and 1955? What happens, of course, is that many of the Black nationalists are pro-Tokyo. That's talked about in my book, Facing the Rising Sun, because since they wouldn't do the history, I felt I had to do it, on how the Black nationalists were all taken by Japan, which, I didn't agree. I don't agree with that position. I didn't agree with it, but I thought it was a legitimate position, speaking objectively, although I would not have taken that position. It was trying to leverage global trends on behalf of Black Americans. Just so happened that Japan lost, and many of the Black nationalists were imprisoned, but that's what happens when you're in politics. You win some, you lose some. And so what happens post-1945 is that with the downsizing of the Black left, like a seesaw, the Black nationalists rise. But I'm not sure if they realize that one of the reasons that they rose was not only because of the downsizing of the Black left, but also the international situation was changing. That is to say, the anti-Jim Crow concessions were driven by the fact that Washington was in a Cold War contestation with the socialist camp, which then had many allies in Africa and the Caribbean, Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba of the Congo, not least. And so in order to improve its position in Africa and the Caribbean, Washington backed away from the more horrific aspects of Jim Crow. But now, of course, the situation has changed. There's less international pressure. And what's interesting is that many of the folks I was talking to, they seem to feel that the reason Jim Crow began to retreat was that Black men in particular began to pound their chests and shout Black power, which I think is naive at best, and that's probably a euphemism. It had everything to do with a changing global situation that creates favorable conditions for domestic advance. And so in some ways, when the socialist camp began to disintegrate in 1989, 1991, well, you could say that the Black nationalist camp in the United States, they won, but they lost because their so-called adversary, the socialists, who they crossed swords with in Tanzania in 1974, began to decompose, but they lost because that changes the international situation. That means that if there are fewer voices to speak out on our behalf at the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, and interestingly enough, the voices that are most likely to speak out on our behalf, like Cuba, for example, like China, for example, they're the ones that they're excoriating. So that also points up to me that this contradiction in this descriptor of African American. That is to say that oftentimes the American outweighs the African, because US imperialism obviously has a bone to pick with Cuba and China. Now, of course, the Black Americans can't come out and say, I'm going to sign up to US imperialism. They have to find some sort of convoluted excuse that keeps them in the so-called American camp. So it becomes, well, the Cubans are racist, the Chinese are racist, they're exploiting Africa, which, and by the way, that latter point is very paternalistic towards Africa. I had one of these fraternity brothers, in fact, tell me that Black Americans are the most powerful Africans on planet Earth. And I was saying, what? I mean, you have this crisis in Mozambique now with religious zealots on the march. Rwandans sent troops, Zimbabweans sent troops. Did Black Americans send any troops? Hell no, they don't have any army. So how did they become the most powerful?
Hey, we sent people to Spain in 1935 and 1936, okay? Word to the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And also, I just want to say for the record, the elephant in the room who you haven't mentioned, and I don't know why, is Richard Gibson. And I don't know why you're evading that. But he's a connective tissue between all of the things you narrated in Southern Africa and then Black nationalism, et cetera, not least his role in writing that book on Southern Africa, which prompted a lot of people to back UNITA, the split in the African Liberation organization. So anyway, I'll put it out there. For some reason, you're evading that name, but I'm just throwing that in the mix.
Yeah, we're here. I second the motion. And of course, the Richard Gibson papers are at George Washington University. They're very rich. Although be careful, I think he's still alive, because I remember a few years ago on a listserv, I made some very dismissive comments about him. And then somehow he got hold of the email and wrote me and threatened to sue me. So he's rather litigious, and obviously he has the force of the state behind him. Oops, maybe I shouldn't say that. So
wait, but they burned him. But in those very JFK papers, they definitively outed him. And so is the state backing them?
I don't know, but I'm just saying, be careful. Maybe he has another sponsor. I think he lives in UK now, so maybe it's Boris Johnson. But in any case, in some ways, this changing international situation helps to explain our rather difficult domestic plight right now. And in some ways, many of our Black nationalist friends, they're like the dog that was chasing the car. The dog catches up, the car doesn't know what to do. And so they were campaigning and crusading against these so-called socialists. And now the socialists are in retreat, and they're left with, joining in this lingering crusade against Cuba and China, even though they're the ones most likely to speak up on our behalf. Now, someone explained that to me.
A related question has to do with the question of whiteness, put that in air quotes, in North Africa, which is something you've been speaking about recently. So what interests you about this, both historically and contemporarily?
Well, what interested me about this were a number of recent news items. You might have followed the controversy involving John Gruden, the SAC coach of Las Vegas Raiders professional football team, whose emails reflected not only homophobia and sexism, but very deep-seated racism in a league that has 70% Black athletes. But what was interesting is that many of these emails were in exchange with Bruce Allen, who was then an executive of the erstwhile Washington Redskins, now the Washington football team. And what's interesting about Bruce Allen is that he's related to George Allen, a former leading politician in Virginia, who was cruising, I think it was to become the next senator from Virginia, when he was caught on camera using a term macaca, which turns out to have racist overtones. And so reporters began digging into George Allen's background and found out that actually his background was in North Africa, in Tunisia, the Tunisian Jewish community at that. And I guess you could call him African-American to a certain degree. And then all the scandals began to proliferate, and he backed out of the race, but Bruce Allen is still around. Point B, in the mayor's contest in Boston, Michelle Wu, who leans to the left, is the apparent winner, or will be the winner, but her contestant is a woman of Tunisian descent who's running to her right, up to and including a very thick Boston accent, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Pak de Kaid, Harvard Yard, et cetera. And then what's interesting, point C, is that if you look at what's happening in France right now, and we have to, these Black Americans need to realize that if you're really going to be serious about politics, you just can't look at what's happening in the United States or even in Washington. You have to have a global point of view, because it's like trying to figure out hurricanes without studying the winds coming out of West Africa, for example. So in the presidential race in France, a major challenger, Mr. Zemmour, is of Algerian descent, Algerian Berber descent, Algerian Berber and Jewish descent at that, although he's running a heavily racist and Islamophobic campaign. He's even campaigning against French people using non-French names. Not only Muhammad, but Kevin, believe it or not, that's a non-French name. So as the saying goes, once is a fluke, twice is a coincidence, 3 times is a trend. And I'm beginning to suspect that there is a trend at play, particularly if I move to point D, which brings us back to the African continent more decisively, and the ongoing conflict between Algeria and Morocco, with Algeria standing to the left and Morocco to the right. Now, if you look at my book on the 16th century, and by the way, the point that I make in that book on the 16th century, marking 1591 as a turning point in the history of Black people, not least because that's when the Moroccans, in league with London, gang up on the Songhai Empire due south and defeat this mighty empire, even though the leaders of the Songhai Empire and Moroccans are all Muslim. And that sends shockwaves cascading throughout the subcontinent, ricocheting as far south as today's Nigeria, softening up a good deal of West Africa for the onrushing African slave trade, which then London in particular benefits from, which is one reason we Black people are now on Zoom speaking English, the language of the British. So I mention that as well because I'm reading a book, which so far I recommend. I haven't finished it. It's by Howard French, Born in Blackness. Fortunately, you have this new trend, which I welcome amongst many Black intellectuals. They're trying to reinterpret the world away from a sort of Eurocentric or even imperialist bias. And even though Howard French is a former reporter for the New York Times, he's trying to do that in this book, interestingly enough. And he also, in the chapter I just finished, points to 1591 as a turning point, which brings us back to Morocco, which means that Morocco in many ways has been the author of our misery. And right now they're in contestation with Algeria on behalf, not of London, but of Paris, because Algeria is still a thorn in the side of France because it defeated France in a war that led to Algerian independence by 1962. People like Zemmour's, the aforementioned Zemmour's ancestors sought to overthrow the government in France, believe it or not, under Charles de Gaulle in order to prevent Algerian independence. And so now Morocco is presiding over Western Sahara, oftentimes described as Africa's last colony, despite the protests of Algeria. And so and then of course, Algeria was in the forefront of the so-called Abraham Accords, which recognized Israel, sold out the Palestinians in league with the United Arab Emirates.
Wait, Morocco was at the forefront of that or Algeria? You said Algeria.
Morocco, oh, I meant to say
Morocco.
I meant to say Morocco.
Algeria, in fact, contested observer status of Israel in the AU.
Yeah.
From more of a historical perspective. So how the US dealt with China in the 1970s has backfired in a big way contemporarily.
Really?
Hence the rampant xenophobia and the move toward a new Cold War. So can you speak a bit about those 1970s dynamics and also how that manifests today? And then thinking with your book that you also mentioned, Dawning of the Apocalypse, how does this compare to the Ottoman deal with London versus Catholic Spain in the 1500s?
Well, I'm glad you raised that because Black people should be rubbing the noses of the Euro-American elite in the muck of that far-fetched deal they cut with China in the early 1970s against the interests of the then Soviet Union, because obviously it's backfired. I mean, China got the best of that deal. That is to say, So China signed on to anti-Sovietism. In return, they got massive direct foreign investment. Manufacturing plants move across the Pacific, helping to accentuate the turn of the US economy to what's called FIRE, finance, insurance, real estate, not necessarily making things. That China's now the factory floor. And by the way, now you see the factory floor moving to the Horn of Africa, which is why this conflict with Ethiopia is so significant. And I noticed that the Tigrayans, in their move south towards Addis, just captured Dessie, which is a major manufacturing center in Amhara, the Amhara province, which has manufacturing investment from Turkey, South Korea, elsewhere. So now, of course, the worm is turned. And so US imperialism, they want to overturn this bad deal that they cut. And if you accept what's put in the Bob Woodward, Robert Costa book, Peril, Mr. Trump in January 2021, just months ago, was willing to blow up the world or threaten to blow up the world or blow up China. I guess he thought he would just blow up China, not the world, although it would have led to blowing up the world if he'd attacked China, and which would have meant the extinction of all humanity, which I would imagine none of us would want to see. And so he could declare a state of emergency and continue as president. And so there's this real crisis in relations between Beijing and Washington. And I have to say, believe it or not, I was around in the 1970s. And yes, true. And I recall it was in 1975 that I wrote this piece called China, Imperialism in Africa. Because of course, China was collaborating with US imperialism in Angola, along with these Black Americans. Believe it or not, I used to have debates. And this is why I don't like to debate with people. I remember having debates with Black Americans during the Cold War. They didn't believe that Washington and Moscow had nuclear weapons pointed at each other because both were white. And so they didn't believe that China was collaborating with apartheid South Africa and US imperialism in Angola, even though some of them probably had roots in Angola, or even had relatives in Angola State Prison in Louisiana, for that matter, because the Chinese were not white. Now it's interesting when you begin to talk, as I have been, about how this deal with China might have backfired spectacularly. It's not only calling into question the viability of US imperialism, but perhaps even white. The comeback, because the Chinese now are white. I thought that they were Asian. I thought, anyway, so I thought it was like pan-Europeanism. Now I guess it's pan-Eurasianism. But in any case, what that bespeaks is people, they have a theory of the case. And if nuisance facts intervene to contradict the theory of the case, they stick with the theory of the case and dismiss these nuisance facts because they're wedded to this theory. And so you mentioned my book on the 16th century, but one of the reasons we're sitting here speaking English is not only because of the Moroccan sellout of 1591, and of course the Moroccans, as I said, were Muslims, it's also because there was another deal between the Ottoman Turks, which arguably was power number one in Europe. And if there was any contestation, it was from Catholic Spain. And they were always at sword's point. You may be familiar with the city across the border from Brownsville, Texas, Matamoros, kill the Moors. An interesting name for a city, although if you understand what I'm Muslims and contestation with Catholic Spain, you get the drift. So what happens is that this irrelevant archipelago on the fringes of Western Europe, Protestant London, they signed on big time to the Lutheran secession from the Catholic Church led by Martin Luther, 1517. And I'm sure you know the story. There's a play on Broadway right now called Six about Henry VIII, the monarch in London, because he keeps wanting to divorce his wives, perhaps even killing his wives till he finds the quote right one. Very curious turn of events, I must say. And the Catholics won't grant him divorce, so he defects to Protestantism. That's the official line. Although, as I say in my book, he really doesn't want all that Catholic property, which is he begins to scoop up, which helps the takeoff of London financially and economically. But also helping the takeoff is the deal that he cuts with the Muslims, the Ottoman Turks, which obviously puts London in the passing lane. The Ottoman Turks begin a slow, steady decline. And by the way, I've tried to comfort the acolytes of US imperialism by reminding them that decline is not necessarily speedy. And US imperialism might be able to hang on, like Ottoman Turkey, which was a major power up until 1919, a scant 100 years ago. So, they shouldn't be that upset. Or look at the Netherlands. It was able to hang on too for a few hundred years. But in any case, it reminds me of the deal with China, because the deal that Ottoman Turkey cut with London did not necessarily work out in Ottoman Turkey's favor. And likewise, the deal that US imperialism cut with China is not working out in US imperialism's favor, which then brings us to the latest news, the hypersonic missile, which has introduced hysteria in Washington. This is the missile you shoot into outer space, and then it can dodge anti-ballistic missile systems before hitting its target. Russia has a hypersonic missile too. I'm not sure if US imperialism does. So this has led to a scramble for new allies, and perhaps may shed light on why these Black American fraternity brothers were sweating me about Cuba and China.
Not sweating you.
That's what I was just laughing at. Well, speaking of Cuba, turning back our gaze to Latin America, I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit more context and background in your assessment of the sort of ongoing aggression and saga between the US and Venezuela, particularly in this moment over Alex Saab.
Yes. So Alex Saab is very close to the Caracas regime. He was headed on a flight eastward, is detained in Cape Verde, part of Guinea-Bissau, and then at the behest of US was then extradited to South Florida, where he still is, to stand trial for various offenses. Venezuela is very upset. It's reminiscent of Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of the Chinese telecommunications giant Huawei, very close to the Beijing regime. She was traveling, was detained in Vancouver, British Columbia, almost 3 years, although she was detained in a mansion, but still, before being released. And of course, the Chinese immediately detained 2 Canadians, not to mention forbidding China. So this is a very dangerous turn of events. We're returning to a kind of law of the jungle. And let me remind the hotheads in Washington that 2 can play this game. That is to say, we already know that when Henry Kissinger, George W. Bush, perhaps even Barack H. Obama travel, they consult with the authorities to make sure that they're not detained for various and assorted transgressions and war crimes, for example. So I would like to remind these hotheads in Washington that can happen, because recall that when Evo Morales was the president of Bolivia, that he was headed back from Russia to Bolivia. His plane was forced to land, as I recall, in Austria, because they thought that Edward Snowden, the man who had leaked all these documents from US intelligence and now resides in Moscow, was on his plane. So this is a very dangerous turn of events. And it also points to the continuing conflict with Venezuela, which is not going away anytime soon, particularly because Venezuela is part of this Latin American bloc that has Cuba in the forefront, and that may come to include Brazil, given the results of the next election in Brazil, where the former President Lula da Silva is expected to prevail. And Washington always has played very close attention to what happens in its so-called backyard, unquote. I mean, I could cite chapter and verse in that regard, but I'm sure your audience is familiar. And so right now, Venezuela is seen as a stumbling block. And let me also add another footnote, which may turn out to be very important. There has been a long-standing territorial dispute between Venezuela and Guyana. And Guyana has now crept closer to ExxonMobil because ExxonMobil has made a major discovery of petroleum in Guyanese waters. Now, despite COP26 and all the hand-wringing about fossil fuels and climate change, ExxonMobil does not seem to be slowing down in terms of exploiting petroleum resources. And what I'm afraid may happen is that because Venezuela is not necessarily playing ball with US imperialism, in fact, after Alex Saab was
No, Maduro is hot. He is done. He's like, we're not going to do this anymore.
They put tighter clamps on US oil executives who were affiliated with Citgo, the Venezuelan company, which still markets in the United States. And so I'm afraid that Guyana could be used as a sort of cat's paw against Venezuela, or a sock puppet, with ExxonMobil being the ultimate manipulator.
Boo.
Yeah, I know you had spoken earlier about Cuba and this. You had kind of spoken to it a little bit about this interesting twist of focusing on racism in Cuba. In regards to the so-called SOS Cuba here recently. So I was curious if you could speak on that more, because I did notice, and I'm sure all of us have noticed, this overemphasis all of a sudden on Afro-Cubans and the so-called plight of Afro-Cubans. And even when Black Lives Matter came out with a statement, a rare radical statement, they were killed for that, basically. So I'm just curious if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, things are coming to a crescendo by November 15th. That's the date when Cuba will be reopening for tourists. It's also the date when dissidents are planning protests. I don't find it coincidental that one of Cuba's defenders, speaking myself, was being hassled in the prelude to November 15th. What's interesting about Cuba, and I wrote about this in my book, which apparently my interlocutors have not written, which, by the way, has been translated into Spanish, which suggests that the Havana authorities found that the book resonated. And it's interesting because what I basically said in this book, among other things, was that before 1959, the precursor of the Cuban Communist Party was dominated by Africans, basically. But what happens is that pre-1959 Cuba was basically a neo-colony of US imperialism, stretching back to 1898, when the United States delivers the knockout blow to the tottering Spanish Empire, and then snatch Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines. And so in that context, you have the rise, particularly after 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, you have the rise of a precursor of the Cuban Communist Party, dominated by Africans. But what happens, in the United States, they're both racist and anti-communist, as you know, oftentimes not even distinguishing between the two. And so they unleash a tidal wave of repression liquidating some Communist Party leaders, jailing and marginalizing others. In the resultant ideological vacuum, you have the creation of the July 26 movement led by the Castro brothers, eventually joined by the Argentine doctor, Ernesto Che Guevara. And they surged to power. And in the early stages, post-1959, US imperialism does not really make an accurate assessment, which is the tendency in Washington. And I think they underestimate the July 26 movement. And then the July 26 movement merges with the pre-existent precursor of the Communist Party, then referred to as the Socialist Party, the precursor that is. But like many nations in this hemisphere, not only the United States, but Canada, Cuba, Mexico, Brazil, Peru, Venezuela. There have been many bumps, shall we say, euphemistically, in the transition away from white supremacy and racism. And then there were mistakes on the part of the leadership, which, as I pointed out to the fraternity brothers, was not their mistake alone. I mean, it has long been alleged common wisdom in many elevated precincts, is that if you remove the objective conditions that gives rise to racism, then you, just like if you don't water the plant, you expect the plant to die. But unfortunately, that was a theory that didn't necessarily prove out. And so even in Cuba, where you basically liquidate capitalist interests and you pass laws overturning US-backed laws that call for segregation on beaches, et cetera, it doesn't necessarily lead, at least not instantaneously, to the withering on the vine of racism, particularly in this context, where since 1959, you've had the fleeing to the mainland of many that could well be called Euro-Cuban families who do quite well. I mean, if you visit Emory University in Atlanta, when you enter the campus, on your left will be the business school named after a Cuban American who was the former CEO of Coca-Cola, a major Atlanta enterprise, for example. And so what happens is that these Euro-Cubans can then send remittances back to their families, which then helps to accentuate class and race distinctions in Cuba, because believe it or not, the Afro-Cubans, other than some baseball players, and that's another story altogether, have not been able to accumulate the kind of wealth that they can then send back to the island. So it's a very complicated issue that is easy to manipulate and exploit by those who do not study sufficiently.
Yeah, especially through media and entertainment. Okay, but you mentioned Eric Williams. And so you, as you said, you recently wrote this piece in The Nation titled "The Politician Scholar, Eric Williams and the Tangled Web of Capitalism and Slavery," which was particularly interesting to me because I read about Eric Williams in my dissertation, specifically the contradiction of his radicalism as a scholar, and even early on when he was the head of the Anglo-American Caribbean Commission, but then he became a stooge of the United States effectively. And speaking of Guyana, he actually mobilized against Guyanese independence for fear that Guyana would become another Cuba. So he was a bum as a statesman in my perspective, but obviously had really radical and interesting scholarship. Although if you read From Columbus to Castro, there's some of that anti-communism in that work. So anyway, but this is not about me, this is about you. Okay, so what were you attempting to convey with that piece? And why do you think that the perspective that you offer in that piece is important in this moment?
Well, in that piece, I was trying to accomplish a number of points, a number of things. Number one, as usual, I was trying to give a beat down to US imperialism, particularly with regard to the founding myth of 1776. And by the way, the founding myth is under withering attack right now. Another book I'm reading right now is by Woody Holton called Liberty is Sweet. Now, Woody Holton, unlike some of these scholars who go to bat for US imperialism, actually has ruling class credentials. I mean, his father, for whom he is named, was former governor of Virginia. His brother-in-law is Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia. And yet, in this new 700-page book, it's one of the few books ever, particularly written by now I won't even say Euro-America, written by somebody other than written by anybody, that really calls into question the founding myth of 1776. And it's a materialist analysis. I mean, in other words, like anybody who's looking at 1776 or the early history of the United States, you have to look at the land question. You have to look at how do you get these Native Americans off the land? I mean, come on, people. And so in that piece of the nation, I was trying to give a beat down to the myth of 1776. I was trying to uplift the idea of the entanglement of capitalism and slavery, hoping that when Black people read that, they'll recognize that their labor was the foundation for the building of this system of capitalism, which is now bestriding the planet like a colossus, and that therefore they may want to be in the vanguard of an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist movement in light of the fact that their ancestors, who they often say that they're honoring, were the kindling that created the fire in the furnace that led to the creation of capitalism. And I was also trying to drop little tidbits. I mean, for example, that would illustrate that. I mean, for example, in that piece, I mentioned the perverse evolutionary logic that leads from Catholics burning Protestants at the stake in London in the 1500s to Protestants and Catholics joining hands in North America and burning Black people at the stake by the late 1800s. In other words, it's part of this bumpy transition from feudalism to capitalism. With us, of course, as not only labor, but capital, as many oftentimes acknowledge. In 1860, on the verge of the US Civil War, the most lucrative investment in the United States was in the bodies of these 4 million Africans. And one of the reasons, I might have said this in the piece I wrote in The Nation in February, that one of the reasons for all the atrocities visited upon Black people and the horrors that we're subjected to has something to do with the fact that post-1865, after the slave owners lose the war, their property is expropriated without compensation. That is to say, us. And so when you have your property expropriated without compensation, you get angry. Sometimes when I'm teaching my classes, and I've been out of the classroom for a few years now, I must confess. So you know how these students, they're fiddling with their smartphones as you're trying to talk. And so I'll go and grab the smartphone. So I'm expropriating your property without compensation. You're very angry now, right? You want to thrash me right this very moment. But that's how the slave owners felt in 1865. And that's how many of them still feel. Because interestingly enough, Britain, when they expropriated the slave owners in Jamaica, Barbados, et cetera, they compensated the slave owners. Let's not get to reparations to the
Wait, hold on. But in your analogy, then why wouldn't the student want to thrash? Why would the student want to thrash the smartphone and not you? So likewise, these whites that got expropriated, they should want to thrash the other whites who took their shit, not us, not the property itself.
Well,
So
it's interesting. I'm glad you raised that because I'm surprised this work has, I've been trying every time, oftentimes when I have a microphone before me, I suggest that there needs to be a study of the attacks and lynching of Euro-Americans who were not sufficiently racist and pro-slavery, for example. I'm surprised it hasn't been done because these Euro-Americans are really into themselves. So I'm surprised they haven't done this study because I think it would shed light even on our present dilemma. Because as you know, the United States is marching stride for stride towards fascism. And I'm afraid to say that not only would people like myself and yourselves be victimized, there'll be some non-Blacks victimized too at the end of the day. I hope they realize that. And so none of the students in my class, I guess they were just so bamboozled by the idea that their smartphone was no longer in their hands. It was like sort of a phantom amputation. You know, they couldn't feel in that hand anymore. And so, but in any case, this is part of this, that's just part of what I was trying to accomplish in that piece, along with other items too, also trying to smuggle in to this piece other issues, such as the fact that many of the people we point to as heroes, Claudia Jones, Nelson Mandela, Kwame Nkrumah, at some point in the careers of all of these figures, they were pro-socialists, for example. Now, of course, we could open the can of worms of South Africa with regard to what's transpired there since 1994. But as I tell these Black Americans, a lot of it has to do with our own dilemma. That is to say, just as I was pointing out a moment or two ago, that one of the reasons why Black people are doing so badly now is that our international backup basically decomposed. It left us naked and vulnerable. And South Africa, a nation of 55 million, with a GDP about the size of the Netherlands, combined with some terrible personnel moves, including putting Jacob Zuma as president for 10 years, has created a dilemma. And although, however, as we speak, there are elections taking place in South Africa, and I'll be studying the outcomes very closely and carefully in coming days.
Speaking of fascism, you have a new book coming out on Texas.
Yes.
Which historically and contemporarily continues to occupy a very contentious position in US politics. So could you talk a little bit more about the historical roots of fascism in the Lone Star State and how it's manifesting today?
Well, sure. I mean, this book should be out next year. The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of US Fascism. In brief and in sum, 1836 is when Texas secedes from Mexico because Mexico, under a president of African descent, Vicente Guerrero, had abolished slavery. Sam Houston, Stephen F. Austin, they weren't going for it. So it's the mini-me of the United States of America, for example, except in a more acidulous manner. What I mean by that latter point is that Texas is the only slave state that has a foreign neighbor, speaking of Mexico, which, as noted, not only had moved towards abolition, but was aligned with Haiti. Some of you may know, who are familiar with Haitian history, about Jacques Rouman, one of the leading intellectuals of the Pan-African world, leading Haitian novelist. I recommend his novel, Masters of the Dew. He was a Haitian diplomat posted in Mexico, for example, in the 1930s, 1940s. In any case, so Mexico is providing backup to the Black people who are trying to escape slavery in Texas, which makes rather ironic some of this anti-Mexican sentiment that you find in the borderlands, particularly Los Angeles nowadays. And it's estimated that thousands of Africans fled across the border, which is outraging Texas. But Texas finds that it cannot stand up to the pressure. So Texas is an independent country from 1836 to 1845. And as an independent country, it's trying to cut deals against the interests in the United States of America, believe it or not, in order to survive, which is another paradox of the United States, which is that some of the people who see themselves as the biggest US patriots are often the ones who are scheming against the United States, like independent Texas, for example. So finally, it gives up the ghost. It enters the United States in 1845, although it probably entered the United States on an illegal basis. Lawyers might want to pick over this and boot Texas out of the United States, because it happened not as a result of a treaty, but as a result of a majority vote in Congress. It should have happened as a result of a treaty, which requires 2/3 vote, but it couldn't get the 2/3 vote. So it enters by a congressional resolution and then spearheads the war against Mexico, which leads to California being taken by 1848. And the reason why we get to fascism is not only the fact that, for example, today, Texas has the largest Black population in the United States of America, for example, and slave revolts were prominent in Texas, not least because the enslaved were getting assistance from Mexico and Mexicans, Mexican Americans. But also, the United States put Indian territory just north of Texas. This is, we call the Trail of Tears. They expelled the Cherokees, the Choctaws, many of whom were slave owners, by the way. And they say you can go to Indian territory, now Oklahoma, for as long as the rivers shall flow and the grass shall grow. Another promise that's not kept. And so you had a substantial free Black population in Indian territory that's assisting the Negroes, the enslaved in Texas, which is leading to further oppression. So finally, the Texans, the Euro-Texans, decide on a plot of extermination. That's the word they keep using. They're going to exterminate all the Indians. Now, if that's not an emblem of fascism, I don't know what is. And largely they succeed, particularly against the Comanches, who were probably the most militant and fiercest fighting force that the settlers ever had to confront. And so they drowned that part of North America in blood, basically, in order to get rid of the Native Americans. And then, this ties up to the point I just made with Charisse, any Euros who objected, they killed them too. You know, I mean, these people were out of control. And so then, of course, Texas, well, I won't go on because I know you all have other things you want to discuss. But in the epilogue, and trying to connect it to contemporary US fascism, I point to the obvious. Not only Ted Cruz, who has a striking resemblance in many ways to Senator Joe McCarthy in terms of visually and voice, the vigilante law with regard to women's reproductive freedom, which of course is being debated in the Supreme Court as we speak, the laws circumscribing critical race theory, which is basically a way to say you can't talk about what I just talked about, which is slavery.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that.
Native American dispossession. You might have heard the story of what happened just north of me, when in a school board meeting, it was counseled that they discuss both sides of the Holocaust, which of course outraged many in the United States of America, because part of the mythology of the United States of America is being more progressive on the Jewish question than the Europeans. But as I say in my 16th century book and 17th century book, this has everything to do with settler colonialism. They needed all the warm bodies that they could muster. And so therefore they're willing to overlook the religious question, which leads you to the First Amendment of the US Constitution, so that they can recruit you to keep the Africans in line and the Native Americans in line. And of course, Texas, which is the second most populous state after California, and which has a majority minority population, And see, one of the points I make in my Texas book, that was one of the reasons why repression has been so profound and significant in Texas then and now, is because resistance has been so formidable, not least because you had Mexico on the border willing to provide backup, at least in the 19th century. And so that caused much more of a fearsome reaction and response. So I'm writing this book as we speak. Here are some of my notes right here. And
we can't see them. Hold them up. I want to
okay.
see the stack. Ooh, it's big. Okay. Rigorous. Great.
Yeah. So I have to say, I'm into this. Well, you know, usually whatever I'm writing, I'm into, but I'm certainly into this project.
Notice the thing, just quickly, you have the theme of two counter-revolution titles and then two apocalypse titles. So at some point we'll have to do an interview about what you see as the connections between apocalypse and counter-revolution.
Right on.
Right. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, definitely looking forward to that book, seriously. Moving on to U.S. politics, not as interesting of a subject, but what's your analysis of the Democrats and what they're doing with the Build Back Never package and what they might be doing about raising the debt ceiling so that the U.S. doesn't default, and how all of this might impact how they'll fare in midterm elections? Also, do you foresee another Trump presidency?
Well, the short answer is that I think that the Trump presidency is a possibility, if not a probability, because one of the points I try to stress that many of our friends on the left do not is the agency and the culpability and the complicity of the Euro-American working class and middle class. I mean, for example, when they talk about West Virginia, they talk about Joe Manchin, the Democratic senator, and his investments from coal companies, which is all true. But West Virginia, which has about a 96% Euro-American population, voted for Trump by 40 points, which means a lot of poor and middle class and working class Euro-Americans have voted for the right. And so once you move away from the mythology of the founding of the United States, and you look at settler colonialism, which was a project involving collaboration across class lines, that is to say, poor Europeans collaborating with richer Europeans in order to confront the Native Americans and take their land and then get enslaved Africans to work for free. This is a class collaborationist project. But if you have a mythological view of the founding of this country, it's difficult for you to see that. And so I think now, Senator Sinema, that's another story altogether. That what she's doing not necessarily represent the constituency in Arizona the way.
Hard disagree. Growing up in Arizona, I would say that Sinema represents, if not a majority, then certainly a plurality of the Arizona constituency, given that it's a transient, geriatric, white population in proximity to the border, and because of the Native American population there. This is why Tucson, Arizona, where I'm from, is one of the poorest cities in the nation, is precisely because of the the sort of the reservation population. And so anyway, I think that all of that coming together, they racist, period. Perhaps not as racist as West Virginia, but they racist.
The point I was going to make is that you have a control group. What I mean is the other senator from Arizona is Mark Kelly. He defeated the same person that Senator a margin, that is to say, Martha McSally. And so if Mark Kelly is not putting himself out front to throw his body onto the gears to make sure that paid leave doesn't take place and subsidized childcare can't take place, well then why can't Senator Sinema imitate Senator Mark Kelly? That's the only point that I was trying to make. But in any case, I don't think you can begin to understand contemporary US politics. And this is one of the many failures of the US left. I mean, there are many failures. We started off with my critique of certain Black nationalist trends. As we begin to wind down, let's do a critique of certain left trends. Not only in its seeming inability to understand settler colonialism. I mean, you have people on the left in the United States who talk about the so-called democratic traditions of the United States of America, which obviously didn't apply to Black people. So they're saluting apartheid traditions, fundamentally. And so who are on the left tipping their hat to apartheid, no wonder we're in trouble. And so this makes it difficult for them to understand what's going on. They wind up doing a subjective analysis. A subjective analysis would be, you're just looking at individuals and their real and imagined failings, like Senator Joe Manchin. They're like a theater director or a movie director. As an actor, you're always asking the director, well, what is my motivation? Why am I saying these lines? And the stereotype director always says, you're crazy. Well, that's not enough. I mean, give me a backstory. And that's what I say to the US left. It's not enough to just point to sellout politicians. You have to ask, why are these politicians selling out? What are the forces impelling them in that direction? And if you're not able to do that, you come up with an inadequate explanation, which ultimately does not shed light and puts us closer on the fast track to being interned en masse in Yankee Stadium or Fenway Park in Boston or Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles, as they did in Chile in the 1970s when they put all the progressive forces in these sports stadiums.
Okay, so there's so much to say about CRT, critical race theory, which you mentioned earlier, and the hubbub around it from both sides. So there's a sort of breathless defense of CRT by people who know nothing about what CRT is as an actual discourse. And then of course the right that's just using CRT as shorthand for anything progressive or anything that actually sheds light on the actual history of this place. And so what do you make of all this? And then especially as it relates to, let us say, the Virginia governor race, the outcome of which we'll actually know by the time this airs, state laws outlying CRT and divisive speech, but also the anti-communism and the sort of anti-leftist nature of CRT. And this contradiction that those of us on the left are like defending this, even despite those roots, because of the sort of the strength of the right at this moment.
Well, it's interesting with regard to all of this backwards and retrograde legislation. Others have pointed out this ebb and flow of US progressivism. That is to say, the defeat of slavery in 1865, followed by Reconstruction, and Reconstruction drowned in blood. And then with the anti-Jim Crow movement arising in the 1950s as a result of forces we've already described, that leads to a counter-reaction in Little Rock in 1957, where President Eisenhower is to send out federal troops to protect Black kids from being mauled by their peers. Ditto, Oxford, Mississippi, Ole Miss, 1962. Ditto, Boston, the 1970s. So many people point out that factually, but I think what they need to point out is that you can expect no less in a country that was founded on counter-revolution. That is to say, that there's this profound, deeply seated counter-revolutionary impulse. And it manifests itself today with regard to an attempt by certain Euro-American working class and middle class forces to reclaim what they consider to be their country, which they think that they've lost because the United States was forced into these anti-Jim Crow concessions in the 1950s and 1960s that then unleashed a tidal wave of other kinds of reforms on women's rights, on LGBT rights, not so much on workers' rights, which is another story that we can tackle at some other point. And so now they're trying to reclaim what they consider to be this lost territory. But once again, the underlying impulse is counter-revolution. And of course, you see counter-revolution in its most naked form globally, where the United States, US imperialism, is the most counter-revolutionary force on planet Earth, seeking to take Cuba back to the Dark Ages, Venezuela back to the Dark Ages, threatening the extinction of all humanity in order to destroy China's advance, et cetera. So as you suggested, we'll know soon what happens with regard to Virginia, although it is at least chastening that Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved, has become a campaign issue. And what's interesting is the right wing, they started off by talking about cancel culture, which once again is a tool handed to them by some on the left. Go back and look at the original statement on cancel culture. You may be surprised by how many people on the left signed that nonsense. And then they were complaining about snowflakes, these sensitive minorities and left-wing people. But now they don't even want to read Toni Morrison because it gives them nightmares. Yeah, that's what it said. The novel is, of course, about slavery and the woman who in real life in the 19th century kills her child rather than see the child go back to slavery. So maybe you should have a nightmare, since that's the country that you salute as being this great leap forward for humanity. But in any case, it's striking a chord with many of these Euro-American working class and middle class voters who are looking for any excuse to turn back the clock. And turn back the clock is precisely what's at issue. Now, I think on the last time I was on this program, this podcast, I made reference to critical race theory because I was around when this CRT was coming to the surface. And I pointed listeners then, and I'll point them again, to my book, White Supremacy Confronted, where I quote exchanges between myself and Derek Bell, the late Derek Bell of Harvard, Barack Obama's mentor and a founding father of CRT. I won't say any more about that, but some listeners might be surprised when they read it. But I'll say this much, so in progressive legal circles, and I was doing law then, there was this debate. Bell and some of these other folks, they were saying that people like myself were too involved in international affairs. And of course, my theory of the case is what I just articulated. We have to be involved in international affairs because the landscape that we face here is so troublesome and problematic. All these right-wing people we're surrounded with, we better call in some backup from overseas. But anyway, as I said, my side lost, which a repetitive theme in this country. And so then they developed CRT. And it's interesting, as I pointed out in our last LDI, it was in contradistinction to critical legal studies, which comes out of the National Lawyers Guild, which also is trying to develop the structural critiques of imperialism. National Lawyers Guild, of course, it started in the 1930s, it's still around today. It suffered during the Cold War and the Red Scare because of allegations of communism, et cetera. And I think there's a little doubt that many of the CRT people, they wanted to develop a critique, bless their hearts, but they didn't want to necessarily be splattered by this Red Scare, which I sort of understand, but they're being splattered by it anyways. That's what's so ironic.
It's like the NAACP vis-a-vis the Communist Party, who they red baited and did all that they had to do and still got infiltrated, still got watched by the FBI, still got infiltrated and still got beat down. So it's like, you don't have to be communist, but if you're anti-communist, you're doing yourself a disservice, because Carlotta Bass wrote about this in the California Eagle. Like, we most of all need we need the civil rights and civil liberties to challenge racism. And when you advocate things that foreclose that space, you're doing the blacks no favors, period. So anyway.
Well, the joke, I'm sure, about a demonstration that's taking place in the United States, and the police wade into the crowd and start cracking heads with their police batons. And one of the persons who's being attacked says, "Don't attack me, I'm anti-communist." And the police say, "I don't care what kind of communist you are, you're going down." And so that's the dilemma that's faced. And I'm afraid to say that some of our CRT friends, they did not necessarily stand tall. I don't think many of them really thought it through, which is a trademark of the US left, I'm afraid to say. And so here we are on the brink of catastrophe. That is to say that if these polls are accurate, the right wing will make a comeback next year, and Agent Orange himself might be back in the White House by January 2025.
Which is actually a great segue to this question of patriotism, which apparently you were recently interviewed about. So I wanted you to speak a little bit more to this question of whether or not Black people should, can be, whatever, patriots in the context of the US.
Well, yeah. I was trying to make the point in that conversation that we should focus on what we can agree on. Women's reproductive rights, protecting voting rights, expanding protections in terms of health and safety for working class people, and anti-imperialist foreign policy, non-interventionist foreign policy. I mean, that's what we should be debating, that's what we should be agreeing on, not whether or not me, of all people, should have the background of the US flag where I live. I mean, I'm not going to do it. So why are we, that's not even worth discussing. I mean, it's almost asking me to contradict everything I've written. You know, I've made all these critiques of US imperialism, settler colonialism, but then all of a sudden I'm becoming a US patriot. People would say, what's wrong with that brother? I mean, is he confused? I mean, what's up with him?
But that would actually do a lot of service if you, who have had such a strong track record of making this particular kind of position, then reverse that. You know what people could do with that? So there's a lot they would like to do with that.
And lucrative. You can finally get the recognition you deserve if you just wear an American flag shirt. Don't tread on me and shit, you know?
I don't know. I mean, these people in the US ruling class, they have long memories. That's
long and short at the same damn time, though. Long memories, except for when it comes to, your funding of the regimes you're now trying to topple. So It's long and short at the same damn time, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, I thought that was a kind of absurd discussion, quite frankly. I mean, here I've written about the national anthem, for example. I think it's in my book, Negro Comrades at the Crown, where I talk about the third stanza written by the slave owner, Francis Scott Key, after the Redcoats not only bombard Maryland, but then put the torch to the White House, sending President James Madison and his girlless spouse, Dolly, fleeing into the streets one step ahead of the posse, in league with the enslaved Africans, who then get on a boat and are transported to a new home in Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. And so I'm supposed to now sing the national anthem, knowing all this history? I mean, I can understand how somebody who doesn't know the history, they could rather naively and blithely mouth the lyrics. The less said about that conversation, the better. I mean,
but what about reparations? Aren't the reparations for the African American ethnic group contingent upon this patriotism?
Well, people believe that. As the saying goes, they might want to buy the Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, I think that reparations ultimately is dependent upon the global correlation of forces and our ability to marshal the international community against these retrograde elements now ruling this country, which actually brings me to another point, which is that I think there's an ideological danger right now of Black nationalism morphing into Black American nationalism. And you see that, I'm afraid to say, with the rise of this so-called FBA movement, Foundational Black Americans, which gives pride of place to the descendants of mainland enslaved Africans, of which I am one, and tends to look askance at folks with roots in the Caribbean and Africa, and that is to say recent roots, I should say, or ADOS, for example. And I think that to an extent, these trends were inevitable. Inevitable not only because of the ideological backsliding that's taken place in our community in recent decades, but also because I think that the assault has been so ferocious. As a matter of fact, this should be point number one. I mean, for example, you have Thomas Sowell, S-O-W-E-L-L, a Black American he's a FBA.
Used to be a Marxist.
Right. University of Chicago, now at the Hoover Institute. This is a guy, you find a lot of people in the United States like this. He writes book after book on the same thing. What's the same thing? Why are these US Negroes so screwed up when you have Black immigrants come into the country and become like Colin Powell, for example, and climb the greasy pole of success? You can't say it's racist, but look, Colin Powell, he got melanin, yet he became a contender for president for a while, head of the Secretary of State, a heartbeat away from the White House. So what's up with you US Negroes? You know, something must be wrong with you folks. And so when you're subject to that fierce ideological assault at a moment when there has been ideological backsliding in any case, inevitably these kinds of trends arise. And then there's the other point, which is tied to the Sowell point, which is that it is true, I believe, that, and I said this in my 1776 book, that the US ruling class has a particular hatred, fear, antipathy, animosity towards those who have been battling them toe-to-toe for centuries, which are the so-called FBA community. And so what we face is not only racism, it's also political, you know, because we're fighting for control, which is not to say, you have to add this quickly before the backwards people run away with it, which is not to say that non-FBA people escape racism and white supremacy. No, obviously that's ludicrous. But historically, when historians of the current period look back, they may not find it coincidental that on the one hand, you have a sellout like Condoleezza Rice, who is FBA, but the others who've been able to climb the greasy pole of success have been Colin Powell with roots in Jamaica, Kamala Harris with roots in South Asia, Jamaica, Barack H. Obama with roots in Kenya. It's very tricky to articulate precisely because it's so sensitive. But if we're going to try to bring clarity to these complicated questions, I think we have to talk about it.
Somebody tweeted recently or on that Pan-Africanism is a tool of white supremacy. So, because, you know, the Pan-Africanists have had such an easy go of it. So, you know, just wanted to throw that up.
Well, as I said, and the point I was going to make further is that this ideological trend, it not only leads from Black nationalism to Black American nationalism, it also leads to anti-internationalism. That's what I gleaned to come full circle from my conversation with these fraternity brothers, because they had the nerve to bash the Haitian Revolution. I didn't know they would go that far, because, you know, I have this whole theory about how the Haitian Revolution is represented in my book, Confronting Black Jacobins. It ignites a general crisis of the slave system that can only be resolved with its collapse. The Haitians sponsored slave revolts like any other revolutionaries, including in North America. And they upset the international system by aligning with abolitionists in London, for example. Dismissed. So it reminds me, I just wrote yesterday, in fact, in the 1850s in Texas, as I was saying, the Comanches or the warriors. They're fighting these settlers toe to toe. But at a certain point, some of the leaders say, these Negroes are doing badly in Texas. So we're going to do them a favor and send them to the spirit world. We're going to kill them. Then I would say, well, when you're under pressure, you tend to make mistakes. And so that's what I say to some of our Black American friends. They're under pressure, and so they make mistakes.
Gerald, this has been amazing and great as usual. I don't know if my colleagues have anything to add, but we definitely will have you back for another installment of LDI Presents the Gerald Horne Report sooner rather than later, I hope. But it's been a pleasure as always.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, y'all, that's our very special episode. LDI Presents the Gerald Horne Report. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, so thanks for tuning in.
I'm Dr. Brown here with Dr. CBS. Special thanks again to our guest, Dr. Gerald Horne, and as always, to Two Black in the Back. And we are signing off.
Peace.